Loving Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for being so gracious to us, merciful and kind. Thank you for all your rich blessings. Thank you for sparing our lives through this week to see the beginning of another Sabbath day. We thank you for this opportunity as well to be able to study together tonight. I ask that you may bless the study tonight, that you may open our minds or allow us to open our minds, and that you may be able to flow through, teach us, increase our knowledge, and give us, make us have quick understanding of current events and present truth as it is related to the gospel for this time. So be with me as I present, and be with each and every one, each home, bless the children and families in a very special way. Be with everybody else who are studying in the movement, and also our Adventist brothers and sisters. Also, in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, my topic is about the Israel Palestine conflict. And so I will be sharing some information with you, mostly history concerning this conflict. I don't know if you all follow world news, but you know it's a very, in the international news. Just recently, probably a month ago or a little bit over, there was another major conflict between these two nations or two people, and it's always devastating and one-sided, where Israel is always the bully, or the one with more power and more ammunition and everything else. So we want to look into this conflict, and we want to see, we want to begin, we want to trace back into history and see where it all began and what caused the conflict, why it is ongoing for so long, and we want to also see if there's any possibility of any resolution or peace between these two people. Okay, so as I said, I don't have any. I wish I had more time to probably show you some geographical maps, locations, but you'll have to use your imagination tonight. All right, so
Lucas,
let's begin.
Lucas, if you have some specific map that you think is very important to show, I can also blend something in if you want me to look something up, just in case.
Okay, all right, thanks. All right, so the conflict started, it's based, as I said, upon a dispute between two groups of people who share the same land, as we know as Palestine and Israel today. Okay, and this conflict uh, began in 1948, according to the history. Um, it began with uh, the establishment of the state of Israel, right? So Israel was the state Israel as we know it today was established in 1948, And the conflict came from the intercommunal violence in mandatory Palestine between Israel and Arabs that began from 1920 and erupted into full-scale hostilities from 1947 and 48 in this 2 year time period. It became so hot that it turned out into a civil war. All right, so because they are living in the same geographical location, it is considered a civil war. Okay, so let's go back a little bit more into history, and I know we can relate to this part of history where um, the Ottoman Empire, as we know about, um, even in our studies, the Ottoman Empire ruled that whole area for centuries. Right? We know that was part of prophecy and its fulfillment. So for centuries, those areas, including Palestine, were under the Ottoman rule. And that particular area was populated by Arabs and Christians. And also a very small number of Jews lived there, and they all lived peaceably with each other. There wasn't any war, any conflict amongst each other at that time, while the Ottoman Empire was 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 in full power. Okay, and so that went on for years, decades, and then a time came when the Arabs began a nationalist movement, and they began to call themselves the Palestinians. And then on the other hand, uh, the Jews came up with this concept, or they came to this belief where they said that that they claim that Judaism is not just their fundamental religion, but they also believe that they deserve to be a nation of their own. Okay, so we see now the 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 up the, this the nationalist ideology springing up in both groups, right? In among the Arabs and also among the Jews, they began to come up with this nationalist ideology and began a movement to identify themselves and claim um, nationalism. Okay, so there we see attention begin to develop. All right, and then so after many years of persecution, the Jews thought that the only way of reaching safety is to have a Jewish state, and they saw that their historic homeland in the Middle East was their best hope of establishing safety. All right, so again, we can refer back to biblical history. We know that the northern kingdom of Israel was scattered because of their idolatry and their disobedience, their rebellion against God, breaking of the covenant, 2520 as we know it. And that was prophetic and also literal. We know that even after, um, during the Roman rule, and even thereafter, uh, the Jewish people were scattered, they were literally scattered and removed from their land. So all this time passed, and they suffered many persecution in different ways, and they were living in misery. And so, as they began to gather and form communities, they realized that, you know what, the best thing they needed to do is to call for a Jewish state, and this Jewish state should be where they originally came from historically, which is in the Middle East, the land that is called Israel today. All right,
Lucas,
so
the
yes,
question. Do you want, if we have questions, do you want us to make them during the presentation or to note, take note of them and then ask at the end?
questions?
If there are questions, you want us to make them during the presentation or at the end?
Okay, yes. Sorry, I didn't. I was supposed to give you that privilege too. You can comment. Um, I would appreciate if you can add in if you have any more um, information to add in besides what I'm sharing with you, or if something comes up that is related to whichever point I'm making, or if you have a question, you can go ahead. Feel free to interrupt me. All right. So
Yeah, I was wondering something. You said that the Jews, the scattered Jews, they made these plans, right?
yes.
But how do I have to imagine this? Because they are scattered everywhere in the world. How did they gather? Did they have a conference, or how did they do this to meet and to decide?
Okay. Remember, I started off mentioning that in that location that was called Palestine, they Muslims and Christians, Arabs, Christians, and a small amount of group of Jews were living there already. And then, as time went on, and I'm going to come here. I'm going to reach that point where I explain it a little bit more. Um, where the Jews began to migrate. Eventually, they began to migrate. You know, little by little, they began to migrate back to the Middle East. Probably when they were
Okay.
financially stable, or when they had the opportunity to move. You know, they began to move back to the Middle East, and I believe it's at that time where they began to farm communities. They came up with
Perhaps I
this
can share a
plan.
screen, a map.
Okay, sure, sure. Go ahead.
So
Okay.
on the left side, you see what you're describing, right? This is all Palestine. There are no
Mm.
Jews. I mean, there's a little bit of Jewish land, but it's not.
Yeah, it's just a little bit. Okay. Uh-huh. And then they began to grow.
All right.
Okay, to the point where now it went from one extreme to the other, or one majority to the other, I should say. All right. So yes. So
Thank you.
okay. Thanks for that assistance. That was very helpful. Visual aid, always helpful. So it was between 1880s, right? In the 1880s to 1910, that tens of thousands of Jews began to migrate back to the Middle East. So that was the time period where they really started an influx back to the Middle East, to their homeland as they know it as. So it's 1880, between that time period of 1880 and 1910, roughly, was where that great amount of migration of Jews took place as they went back to their homeland. Then came World War One, right? World War One started in 1914, lasted until 1918, 1919, as it died off. Um, and so um, after World War One, the Ottoman Empire, as I mentioned earlier, who were ruling that whole area, it collapsed. Then the British took control of Palestine. Okay, and then remember, we learned about the leagues of nations that 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 group of or that power that was formed to regulate, laws or policies so that another war wouldn't break out, a world war. They were intended to bring about uh, world peace, or at least unity in some form among nations, especially European nations. So the League of Nations issued a British mandate for Palestine. And this British mandate is a document that gave Britain administrative control over the region and included uh, provisions for establishing a Jewish nation, a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, which went into effect in 1923. So that was what the League of Nations issued, and it remained. Okay. Now, my question to you, if somebody can remember, I remember Sister Ellertes, covered this point in one of her presentation where she kind of explained how the transition went from Protestantism being against Jews to going over to calling them an ally. Does anybody remember that study or anything from it? Because as I read in this note, and this is again notes that I got from as I did my research here. It mentioned that Britain, right, which was a very powerful nation at the time, they gained control of Palestine, and then they decided to establish a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. Why? What? My question would be what motivated them, or what triggered them, or caused them to establish a Jewish national homeland in Palestine instead of, on the other hand, establishing a Arab national homeland? Because as we saw on the map, the previous but, example that Marco showed us, it was the Arabs who largely lived or settled or populated that area. So the question would be why did the British government decide to take side with the Jews? So that's just a question I'm throwing out to you. If you haven't thought about it before, uh, um, or if it popped up in your mind while I mentioned it, it's a I believe it's a very important question to ask. And now
Lucas,
this is my point of view, so I want to hear your point of view.
you're on mute.
I would link it to where, because of
Excuse me, brother Lucas.
the World War II and everything. Just let me finish before you come in.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I'm just trying to remember what I learned from the letters, but I haven't got my thoughts together as yet. So go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that Judeo-Christian nationalism came
Mm-hmm.
about when Christians in America. It was a bit after the 1888 conflicts down into the 1900s. Remember, it was the women's right that destroyed the first movement, and after that movement,
Repeat that again. Didn't get through just
remember
now.
it was the women's right that came in that dismantled, that helped to dismantle the first movement, and that first movement was the the NRA movement, um, the 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 rights for women, and the the voting rights, and all of these things helped to dismantle that movement. So um,
All right.
after that movement was
So
dismantled,
that's around the same time period of the end of
yeah,
World War One, right? So that was like
yeah.
1920s around that time. All right.
After that, Christians, Jews um, start to appear in the United States. Immigrant and Christians in the United States start to realize that they share common beliefs with the Jews, because they believe that America was the land that God provided for them to inhabit, to be free from persecution. It
And
was a land that
to have dominion,
yeah,
the belief of having dominion over all things,
over
dominionism.
all things. Yeah, yeah, dominionism. So when they start to come to the idea that they share common ideology with the Jews, then they start to realize that they that their Christian heritage actually came from 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 the Jews, because their Christian heritage came from Christ, and Christ was a Jew. So they start to have this Judeo-Christian mindset, and they
Hmm.
start to develop themselves more into that idea that you know um United States also need to what you call United States need to control the world. United States need to be the model in Protestant doctrine, and what Christ is all about.
Hmm.
But what what triggered the issue over to the Middle East was when they come to the idea of where Christ is coming back.
So that had to do with theology, right? Because that's what
Yeah, that
I was
had to
thinking
do with
about.
theology.
It was those Protestant. It had to do with a change in their theology. The Protestant preachers or pastors
Yeah,
began to you know reform their theology in order to better grasp a larger audience of minds. So yeah, it had to do with a lot of theology. So go ahead. Sorry for interrupting.
you could go ahead, Brad.
Okay, that's all. All right. Yeah. So yeah. So I'm familiar with that history.
Lucas, you could go ahead.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I was saying I'm familiar with what you shared. So thanks very much. It helped develop this topic. Give us some more insights of how this um, the establishing of this Jewish nation homeland came about. I also wanted to add in that as America saw itself to be the watchdog of the world and they want to be the arbiter of the world and so forth. You know, I learned that also that they saw that Israel was like their little brother that they had to protect, and so that's why they became very close allies, and it had to do with what you mentioned, the theology behind it, as the dominant religion in America has always been the evangelicals, the Protestant churches, and so they adopted their theology to look to Jerusalem, as you mentioned, as that special place where the Messiah will return, or where Christ will return. You know, and we know it's based on false doctrine, so it's just their belief system, and so that's why they are so allied with Israel, even up to today. I understand they give Israel about 3 point something billion-dollar every year, right? Just for them to arm themselves and remain powerful in the Middle East. So, but as we saw here in this historical record, that it began with Britain starting it off. So I'm still curious to. I guess I have to find out more about the relationship of Britain with Israel as well. Okay, so again, remember that came into effect in 1923. Britain and France, after World War One and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, it was Britain and France who, on a larger part, had the spoil of of the area, of the whole geographical location, the spoil of the war. Um, and so it was between Britain and France. They carved up the Middle East into sections, and this is how Britain ended up with Palestine. And so they began to establish their power and the authority over Palestine between 1919 to 1948, as I mentioned earlier. At the first, they allowed the Jews. So remember, the Jews are migrating, right? They're coming across in groups and one by one, different numbers. They're migrating back from wherever they were, different locations across the globe, especially in Europe. I would say they migrated, and even when Britain took rule over Palestine, they allowed the migration to continue. But it reached a point where there were too many Jews coming over and settling in. They began to settle and farm more formal communities in Palestine, and this triggered tensions. All right, this caused tensions to arise between the Jews and the Arabs. Eventually, the Jews where they literally began to fight, to war each other. The fight that by the 1930s, the British government began to limit Jewish migration. So they began to clamp down on it because, again, the Arabs, as we see in the historical record, were there in larger population first. So it was more right in the sight of Britain to limit Jewish migration than anything else, trying to stay the conflict. So what happened? The Jews, they decided to form militias, and these militias were formed to not only fight the Arabs now, but also Britain. Okay, so now the Jews, they were powerful in number enough to even fight Britain itself. So they were making they're marking their territory, and they were making a statement from then on that they were there to stay. And then came the Holocaust. We know about the Holocaust with Adolf Hitler, World War II time period, him trying to rule the world in tyranny and in Nazism, again, nationalism. Okay, so that's the theme, if you're following, that's the theme of this whole conflict. And, um and so the Holocaust also caused many more Jews to flee to the Middle East because they were the target of this Holocaust. Millions and millions of hundreds of millions of Jews died in this Holocaust. So those who could have escaped, they did so quickly, and the place that they headed for was again to the Middle East, or to Palestine. And then the governments of the world began to support this call for a Jewish state. All right, so now it wasn't just England and America supporting Israel as a state, or the call for it to become a state, but the other European countries, the powerful ones, they also joined in and and agreed that Israel should become a state, or the Jews should have their own state. And so we saw again. I'm trying to remember the test presentation. Another trigger that caused there was something else that caused the evangelicals or Protestant churches to ally with the Jews. It had to do with their covering up, because they wanted to they wanted to become more subtle. So they made friends with the Jews in order to cover up their real agenda, which we know was the establishment of church and state. So
Lucas,
yes, I don't know if anybody can help me remember how that presentation went. Go ahead, Marco.
there is a question from Solange. She says,
Uh-huh.
is there perhaps another issue, a political issue behind this conflict and not religious? She's asking if Russia, she's remembering that Russia maybe had something to do with it. You remember that? I remember something along the line.
Yeah. So okay. So someone, yeah, Solange is reminding me. Yeah. So I don't know if can she come in. I need help. I'm trying to remember. There are so many presentations I've heard, and some of it it's not too fresh in my mind. But yes, it had to do with Russia, right? So remember, Russia is America and Russia. They became enemies, even
I don't remember
historically
very
and
well.
politically. Huh?
I remember that Russia was claiming to be the protector of Christianity in this time,
Okay.
of Christianity of the world.
Of the world.
and this continuously became an issue with the Britons, who started to also operate in that area. But I don't remember much more than that. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So okay. Yes, but Russia had something to do with it as well. Um, yeah, because you remember even when you bring in the papacy, uh, you remember the papacy, according to the vision of Fatima, they were to, yeah. I'm trying to remember how it all developed, but it had something to do with that. I'll just leave it as that because I'm trying to remember. It's not coming. So okay, so let's get back to what I was sharing. Um, so the other European nations supported the call for a Jewish state, and then that caused a sectarian conflict to develop even worse between the Arabs and the Jews. It grew and got even more deadly. So it became a sectarian conflict. Remember, both of them are claiming to be the Jews are saying they are Zionists, the Arabs are saying that they are Palestinians, and so it created a sectarian conflict. The United Nations that replaced the League of Nations devised a plan to divide Palestine into two separate states. So that was, you know, a solution that they came up with because of this growing conflict. They decided, okay, let's see if this will work. We're going to divide this piece of land into two separate states: Israel for the Jews and Palestine for the Arabs. And they thought that probably that would have resolved the problem, but it didn't. But during this draft, the city of Jerusalem was to be the international zone for both states. So they were to share Jerusalem. Okay, so this was done to end the sectarian violence between the two groups. The Jews accepted the plan. They were happy with the plan and they rejoiced because now they established their Jewish state. They became their own, became independent, their own nation. But the Arabs, on the other hand, didn't accept it. The Arabs complained that it was just another form of European colonialism, trying to steal away their land. Right. So the Arabs, they weren't with it. They didn't see any benefit from having two separate states living in the same land. They complain and they didn't say it right or fair, and they accuse the United Nations and the European nations that have been stealers of as they were indeed stealers of land.
What year you
Many of
said
the
this
Arab
was?
states
Sorry? The year, can
repeat
you repeat?
ah
What year are we in?
this is right after World War One and World War Two. Sorry, this is 1948, 1949.
Okay, okay.
Yes, this is 48, 49. Okay, so again, that marked the establishment of Israel as a Jewish state. 1948 in record went down as the year Israel became independent. So yes, the Arabs weren't with it. They didn't agree with it, and so they kept on fighting or being bitter about the whole thing. Many of the Arab states were who won their independence joined forces to fight against Israel and declare a unified Arab Palestine. So what happened is that, remember, this is the Middle East, so it wasn't just Palestine. There were many other uh, countries, Arab countries, Arab states, and they themselves also were aiming for independence. And when they did, they they joined forces to fight Israel. And the purpose of this war with Israel is to declare a unified Arab Palestine. So their intent was to remove the Jews from Palestine completely and make it Arab, make it a full Arab nation. They didn't, again, they weren't with that plan to have separate states in this, in living in the, or occupying the same land. But Israel won that war against the unified Arab, the joint forces of the Arab states. Israel defeated them and took the western part of Jerusalem. So now, remember, Jerusalem was to be an international zone. No one owned it. It was to be shared. Now, because Israel won this war, they seized the western part of Jerusalem and much of the land that was for Palestine. So they conquered the Palestinian territory that was given to them in the first treaty or the first plan by the League of Nations. Then they expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes that brought about a refugee migration. So this is where the migration of refugees from Palestine started out around this time period where Israel now became real militant and dominating in taking over the entire land. So it was the intent of the Palestinians or the Arabs to take over the entire land, and it flipped on them, and it turned out now that Israel now had this intention to completely occupy the entire land. They didn't. This whole plan of having two separate states in the same area was scrapped, at least in the intentions of these of the government now, or this Israeli power. All right. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all the area except Gaza, which was controlled by Egypt. So Gaza at that time, when Israel won the war against the Arab forces, the Arab state forces, Israel conquered. Remember, it conquered Western Jerusalem, and a majority, a huge part of the Palestinian territory. And the only area they didn't control was Gaza, because Gaza was under the dominion of Egypt. So Egypt had control over Gaza. And then another area that they did not conquer was the West Bank. If you follow the news again, or Marco, can you haul up a map there for us, showing us Gaza and West Bank, if it's possible?
Yes,
So
give me a
West Bank
second. I have something here.
was under the control of Jordan. So these were the two territories that Israel did not conquer, but the other ones they did. Did you say something?
Yes. This is, I think, the war that you're talking about, development.
Okay.
Am I right? Is this correct? You have Gaza
Yes.
there.
Yes, that's a partition. All right. So you have Gaza on the far left in that corner there. and then you have West Bank, where West Bank would be again in the middle area on the far right of the map. Okay, so uh, that's okay. Yeah, so thanks again. Yeah, so that these two territories were the only two areas that Israel did not take control of after they won the war. So this fueled the decades-long war between the Arabs and Jews. So this was really the trigger point. This is where this war that we see going on today really kicked off. The beginning point of it, to the point where the Arabs really decided that they really need to get up and fight for the land, or else they will lose everything. And this caused more people to fled as refugees. Coming up into time, 1967, Israel and other Arab states fought once again. And again, Israel won the war and seized Golan Heights from Syria. They seized West Bank from Jordan. So at this time now, they took West Bank and Gaza and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. So Egypt had rule over Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, and Israel took these areas as spoils spoils of war from these Arab nations. They occupied Palestinian territories, including Jerusalem. So they fully took over Jerusalem as well. All right. So again, if you see the development, you can understand now why there's such a big conflict even over Jerusalem. I remember Donald Trump being, claiming to be a evangelical Christian, even sided again with the Jews in putting the claiming that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel instead of leaving it as an international zone. So you see the biasness all the way up into recent time. So Israel took over Jerusalem and they seized Gaza, West Bank, and Golan Heights. This was when Israel gained a stronghold or strong hand to govern all the Palestinian territories from then on, right? Which has been for decades now. So because Israel now sees all these areas, they they had that power, that governing power to to rule over the entire land. So again, this should explain to you now why when you see on the news the Palestinians are barricaded, they need passports or permission to pass from one area to the next and all these things. Why even right now, or since the beginning of this year when the vaccine became available, now you can understand why Israel was able to be the first to vaccinate the majority of their population, and the Palestinians were dying off from the coronavirus in thousands and thousands, and not being able to get vaccines because they needed permission from the Israel government to even ask for a vaccine or for even medical treatment for medicines and so forth. Whatever the Palestinians need even up to today, and it started back from way back then, 1967, Israel controlled everything. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty called U.S. Broker Camp David Accords, After that, Israel gave they returned back Egypt. They returned back to Egypt. They gave back to Egypt the Sinai Peninsula. So that was how it was given back to Egypt. Gaza remained with the Palestinians, but the Sinai Peninsula was given back to Egypt. The other Arab states eventually made peace with Israel, but they never signed any formal peace treaties. So eventually, the other Arab nations they decided to leave Israel alone. The Israeli continued to occupy and govern West Bank and Gaza, causing the conflict between the two nations to continue. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including with acts of terrorism. Okay, so so the Palestinians, they formed an organization, a body called the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And the sole purpose of this organization was for them to fight to regain their independence from Israel. And they were so intent of doing so that they even went as far as uh, committing terrorist acts to achieve their goal. They wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. So again, it's nationalism, the spirit of nationalism was bold in these both nations. Palestinians, their plan has always been now to eradicate Israel, to completely get rid of them. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. Meanwhile, the Israelis were moving in more and more on the Palestinian properties. Okay, so what happened now is that Israeli families now begin to move from their location, from their area where you're supposed to live, from their territory. Now they began to move into Palestinian territory and take over their properties, their land, and their houses. And there are three reasons why this movement began. And these three reasons were for religious motivation. The Jews, again, uh, many of the Jews believe that because they are God's chosen people, they have the right, to rule the entire land. And different beliefs, even the beliefs about the Messiah coming, because remember, they don't accept Christ as the Messiah. So they believe a Messiah is coming and they need to be in Jerusalem to receive this Messiah and so forth. So religious motivations were one of the reasons why many Israelis began to move over into Palestinian property. Also, another reason is political reasons. Some kind of reason that had to do with politics, and also, and that included the government subsidizing housing. So, third reason was that they found house cheaper in Palestinian area regions. So they were able to get a house for themselves easier, and it was, if they had to rent or so forth, or even buy a home, it was far cheaper on that side. The Israel government placed soldiers to guard the borders and entry points. So again, they began to tighten their grip on the entire land and began to rule over the Palestinians with an iron fist. The Israelis were encouraged to force to force the Palestinians off their lands and cause them to leave. So again, the nationalism just grew stronger and stronger. They made the occupation almost unbearable for the Palestinians, and on a long term basis, the Israelis made it more difficult and even almost impossible for Palestinians to ever claim back their state of independence. So this is a conflict that we see and we hear about that is going on presently, where the Israelis, uh, as families and individuals, they feel like because the government, the Israel government, has rule over entire land, that they have right to possess the land and even displace Palestinian families. This recent conflict, I was looking at it on the news, and one of the concern was that there are many Palestinians living in Jerusalem, and they began to give them deadline to move, and they can move their homes if they can pay for it, or if not, they will burn down their homes, and they still have to move. So it was like an ultimatum they gave the Palestinians. I didn't hear what became of it, but it was very threatening. In 1987 to 1993, there was the first in in intifada. So this first intifada is translated as Arabic uprising. Arabic uprising. So they decided to uprise between 1987 to 1993, and again, sole purpose was to try to get back their territory and their independence. It began with protests and boycotts, but eventually became violent. Israel responded with ammunition, and they murdered thousands of Palestinians. Just a few Israelis died. And we see that as a recurring case as well. Every time they war, the deaths of the Palestinians is disproportionate to the deaths of Israelis. Around this time, Hamas was formed. All right, so that's between 90. This was like in 1993, around that time, early 1990s, 93. Hamas was formed, and it was created vowing to completely destroy Jerusalem, to destroy Israel. So this terrorist group, as we know as Hamas, was formed because they said that remember they had a previous organization called the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Hamas was saying that they were too soft and they were not achieving the purpose of what they were for. So Hamas decided to become more radical in getting rid of Israel as the desire to. In 1993, the Oslo Accord, was signed to bring peace. So there's a signing called there was a treaty signed called Oslo Accord, 1993, and the purpose was to bring peace. It was between the Israeli and the Palestinians, and the America was the one to see over this treaty. So the purpose of it was for Israel to return the independence of the Palestinian people, the government to give them freedom and independence, and but Israeli just partially did so. So it wasn't a complete uh, restoration of, 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 of the Palestinians being able to rule themselves, self-governance, it was just partial under this treaty. So this was the agreement of the treaty. This was how it was drafted up. It was drafted up in three areas: Area A, B, and C. Area A stated that the Palestinians, they will possess civil security, uh, civil and civil and security are also self-rule. Then Area B, Palestinian would have civil governance to a certain extent, but at the same time, Israeli security will have control. So Palestinians were given some rule over themselves to govern, but at the same time, Israeli was the one to hold security over the entire region or the entire land. Area C had to do with Israelis control, security, and almost all governance. So it just made them feel like they were able to gain some rule over themselves, just partially, but really and truly, Israeli remained in control. Members of Hamas launched terrorist attack. They launched suicide bombs to try to sabotage the whole process as they were putting in this treaty in place because they didn't agree with it. And then they reached, so they were putting, it took time to put everything in place, and they had to sign another treaty, another Oslo Accord treaty, and the nationalism grew even more intense or became more far right than ever before. At this time, at this point, it reached to an extreme where, because the Israeli prime minister at that time signed the second Oslo Accord treaty, he was shot by his own people. He was shot to death. So this is the prime minister being killed because they considered him a traitor to Israel for signing the second Oslo Accord. So Israel reached a point, the nation reached a point where they decided that, you know what, we have so right to this land. We are God's people religiously and even civilly. They they claim to be the one to rule the entire land. Then in 2000 to 2005, the second Intifada uh, triggered off, started, another war started that was more violent than the first. 1,000 Israelis died and 32,000 Palestinians died in this second Intifada. And so that was 2005, around that time that second war ended. And we see the conflict arising from time to time. Again, I referred back to a month or a month and a half, 2 months the most ago, where the where Israeli went into the Muslim mosque while they were having their special feast day, forget what you call it, and they started, they trigger off another war amongst themselves, which again caused Hamas to fire many rockets, the bombs, and some of them broke the protection, that dome that Israel say they have to protect them from missiles and so forth. it broke the dome and it caused some deaths. But again, the death toll in Israel was far less than how many died in Gaza. All right, so we see here that this conflict, if you have been following me, to me, it's has to do with nationalism, and it's completely unfair. I would say there are many in favor for Israel. There are many in favor for Palestinians. The the debate has been ongoing, and I used to listen to discussions on these topics, but I didn't I didn't know who to believe because there were different arguments from both sides. I know, as I went through this study, I did my own little research here. I can see clearly that it's Israel who is really wrong. But that's just my opinion. I might be wrong as well too. But so this is what I found out so far, and so I shared just share this with you. If there's any questions, is anything else you can add into that can contribute and build up this study and bring more clarity. So the question is, will there be any resolution to this problem? So far as we know from our studies and what God is revealing to us, I'm sure there will not be any solution to this problem because it's one of the issues that will bring about the Sonderla crisis and even the time of trouble, which has to do with nationalism. We know the test is uh, sexism, but remember when the message came in um, 2018 to 19, it was nationalism, nationalism, sexism, homophobia. So we still see this nationalism lurking around. It's what the far right bodies are feeding upon. This is what is galvanizing them together, bringing them into unity, into a confederacy. As the world is polarizing, mainly by the use of uh, information, by the dissemination of information. We know about the two streams of information, the right and the false, and so forth. This is what is all leading up to. And just recently, Israel got a new prime minister. Um, Benjamin Netanyahu was removed. So we see that this new prime it was a combination of people who formed the body, the party, and an Arab is a member of this new government. So we'll see how it develop. But as we see, it's all based on nationalism, so it will only get worse. Okay, so that's my presentation for tonight. I hope I
Thank you,
didn't bore
Lucas.
anyone or cause anybody to fall asleep.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I know you didn't have much time, so we appreciate this especially. And I'm looking forward for everyone else. And this is like a new chapter in our studies, right? After reading the book, now presentations. It's very good. Thank you very much for all the information.
All right. You're welcome.
Better
Hope
understanding
everyone.
now.
Any comments? Any questions? Any observation?
Um, I'd like to say that couldn't the nations that the United Nations, the League of Nations, and America and all the other countries that empowered Israel see this coming before it happened? Because
If they saw it
Israel,
coming, this
yeah,
okay.
this Israeli nationalistic takeover,
Mm-hmm.
um, because they are empowering Israel. So um, if you empower someone and give them all the ammunitions they need, most likely they will disregard all measures eventually.
Yes, yes. Yes, and that's where it's at right now because Israeli doesn't listen to America anymore. They don't regard America uh, when it comes to their policies and their recommendations. Israeli sometimes, especially under Benjamin Netanyahu, they were very arrogant and he he waived a lot of advices that was given by especially Obama. He didn't listen any at all, and still year to year they receive 3 point something billion dollars, even if they don't listen. So they became their own monster. Yeah, well, that's a good question. Did these nations see this coming, was it intentionally done? That's a very good question. Okay.
Well, from the religious perspective, it is not bad, right? From the religious extremist dispensationalist, sorry about this spelling, perspective,
Uh-huh.
Israel has to create a crisis. Israel um, has to stimulate the situation there. I mean, it's their conviction. It's part of the biblical prophetic view.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I
Yeah.
believe
Yeah.
many are
Okay.
fine with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in that perspective, yes, I guess America is fine with that.
Yeah. Yep. So yes, and that's another thing that's why I believe America keep funding them is because they see Israel as a strategic strong strong stronghold for them because remember they have a major base in Israel, a military base, and they can use Israel to 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 maneuver whenever they want in that area in the Middle East and those areas. So they have their benefits for maintaining Israel in that way financially and supporting them in their views and in their practices and even in their way of governing and so forth in tyranny.
I have another question. Is there a country nearby that would welcome refugees from this conflict?
From Palestine,
Yeah,
well, it's hard because war is occurring all over in the Middle East, but Syria and Syria and even Jordan and these other countries they accept them, they allow them to come in, but it's not that like they're going to a better place. Um, Turkey and these areas they accept refugees, but it's no better there than where they are coming from. So
Jordan, Lebanon, Syria.
Yeah, Lebanon, all these areas, they are war ravaged. So yeah, it's a disaster in that whole area, Middle East. It's very sad. Yeah. Okay. So again, thanks for for your participation. Thanks for your time, for listening. I hope you learned something. I did my little research. I have a lot more to learn, but as time go by, I will continue to look at this particular study. And I hope you do too. The internet is vast. It's at the reach of your fingertips, so you can expand on these knowledge as well, these
Yeah.
information.
Thank you, Brother Lucas.
You're welcome. God bless you all. And we'll close with a word of prayer if there isn't any more comment or question.